Whenever you open a photo in Photoshop and it looks a little lackluster or lacking in any kind of contrast like this shot, then the chances are it has to do with the levels and curves. So the first thing I always do when opening an image, and if it doesn't look quite right, is I go to Image, Adjustments and Levels, and you see it here, it brings up here the light histogram. Now when you have a gap here at the right hand edge towards the peak of this kind of mountain, that means you've underexposed it slightly, and the gap at the other end means there's elements of the shot that's maybe overexposed. So the first thing I would always do is to bring the slider over here. If you left click on this slider and just bring it over to the base of the peak, you'll see that it's lightened the image straight away. Now you have to keep watching the highlights to make sure you're not going to clip them and overexpose. Let's take it a little bit further and see what happens. You can see as we go further to the left, we've blown out all these highlights, so you have to make sure that you don't overdo it. So use a visual reference, watch the photo as you're dragging across, but also kind of keep it within the limits of this peak here. So if we leave that one there, we can see here we haven't overblown the highlights, but we've created a much brighter image. And then if you want to, you can always bring the other slider over a bit to add a bit more contrast into the shot. And if we hit the preview button, you can see what a difference that's made straight away. Everybody knows that bubbles are supposed to be quite white, especially if, as we used flash in this case, you can see the highlights in the eyes where we've used bounce flash, and you can see what a huge difference just by adjusting the levels that's made already. Now I would normally leave that at this point and maybe work on the eyes to brighten those, but let's just quickly have a look at the curves as well. If we go into curves, now most people create what's called an S curve with the curves, and that just adds a bit more contrast again. If you go towards the top of this line here and just click in it and drag it up ever so slightly, again watching the photo to make sure you don't clip any highlights and overexpose the image, go as far as you like just to make it as bright as you want, but I never really overdo these. And then we do the same the opposite way down the bottom here to create the S curve, just to add a bit more contrast back. Only has to be really subtle movements, but that looks okay to me. You can see we've made, again, very fine adjustments. You can see the face here lightens ever so slightly, so I'm pretty happy with that. But you can see how much of a difference just by adjusting the levels and curves makes. If we go back and revert to the original, you can see there that's the original, and then we go back to the worked on image, you can see what a huge difference it's made. Now once you've done the levels and curves, if you've got any of Kubota's actions, you can actually brighten the eyes slightly. There's one I like particularly in Kubota's Action Pack Volume 2, and it's actually one of my favourites. So if I go into my favourites, it's called Digital Fill-in Flash. Now this will actually ask you to start painting where you need light. It'll give you a default brush size. Obviously that's too big to go on the eyes, so I'm going to reduce that slightly to about there, maybe a bit smaller. And also you can adjust the opacity and flow of the brush. Now I'm going to see what this looks like with just that. It looks okay by using the opacity at 30%. I can just lighten the eyes, and you can always double click to do it again. So do it once, let go, click again to add a second one, and we can just add a bit of lightness in the eyes there, keeping a bit of shadow under there. No, let's revert that back and then just do a little bit under the eyes and the skin here. I'm going to leave the shadow here because it needs to be there, but maybe just brighten the eyes ever so slightly to make them stand out a bit. Maybe like so. It's a really handy tool, the Digital Fill-in Flash, but it's again used sparingly and only when needed. But I think you can see a huge difference there that the levels and curves have made. So find a photo that looks fairly lackluster or dull, and see if you can work on the levels and curves. But like I said, whenever I open a photo for the first time in Photoshop, I always check the levels just to make sure we've got layers open there. Always just to make sure that there is no massively over or underexposed areas of the photo. You should normally end up with no gaps at either end, and you know you've got a pretty well exposed photo. Hope that helps, and we'll see you on the next video.